Okay, so let's go ahead and open up the next session. We're going to continue on the theme of bias and what it looks like and how to overcome it. And our next panelist discussion is going to be with Elise Shaw, who's the director of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. And she's going to share some of their latest findings and hot off the press new research. Over to you, Elise.
Thank you. Hold on, let me get this going. So they said I had 45 minutes, so everyone be prepared. I dove all in. So Suzanne, thank you so much for introducing me. I am going to go through a whole host of research that IWPR has done over the past about 6 years in this space. So we will dive into it. First, I would like to say thank you to UC Berkeley and the USIP Alliance for inviting me to talk about such an important topic. I really believe that innovation is a hallmark of American culture, and yet women and people of color are woefully underrepresented as inventors. A greater diversity of perspectives is essential to ensure that we discover the solutions to some of the world's biggest problems. I mean, we're seeing it today. Challenges as pandemic outbreaks, food insecurity, and climate change. The solution to these issues are out there. I truly believe that, but experts need to solve the problems. We have to ensure that everyone has the access to the resources to get their ideas out there, to get the support they need. So, real quickly before I jump into our data, for those who are not familiar with the Institute for Women's Policy Research, we were founded in 1987. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank in Washington, D.C. We use both qualitative and quantitative analysis, and we really look at public policy through a gender and racial equity lens. So we build evidence to shape policies that grow women's power and influence and close inequality gaps. And we really work to improve the economic well-being of families. We have been doing, like I said, we've been doing this research on gender and racial patenting gaps for about 6 years. We've worked very closely with Invent Together over the years, and Invent Together is a campaign supported by various stakeholders, really dedicated to understanding and closing the gender, race, and other diversity gaps in invention and patenting. Together, we've convened 2 roundtable workshops, bringing experts from all over the United States and from all different backgrounds and areas to talk about these issues. And IWPR, again, has, out of these workshops, has developed a number of research projects that I'll get into today. So the data and information I'm presenting comes out of 4 main research projects. But first, I'm going to just pull some data and set the stage. It's kind of to walk you through what you'll be seeing here. What do we know about gender diversity and patenting and the gaps? I'll quickly go through some of the recent data. Then I'm going to discuss the implications for the lack of diversity in patenting, how this has real life impacts, specifically on women entrepreneurs. And next, I'm going to turn to the findings from my most recent research project, which was just released last week. So hot off the presses, like Suzanne said. And this research takes a dive into women's experiences with the patenting process. And is a project where we really dove into what is this like, and I'll go through that. It's, we want to know from the time you got your idea to the time you got patent granted, what challenges, what supports, what was the experience like for women who were successful in patenting. Then I'm going to move kind of back in time a little bit, but I thought it worked well in this flow to our research on programs that are promoting equity and inclusion, with some of the key findings and lessons learned from people who are already working in this sphere. What do they find as helpful? How do they find success? And then finally, I will cover some of our lessons learned from all of this huge area and body of research, policy recommendations and next steps that can be taken by all different people and actors. This includes recommendations for programs, academic institutions and organizations and corporations, policymakers, and even individuals. So a lot. We're going to cover a lot today. And hopefully we'll have time for Q&A. So as I'm going through it, please feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we will try and get to as many as we can after I'm done. So first on the data, women in patenting data really just shows the need for faster progress. So since the 1970s, since the late 1970s, women's progress has grown. It's gone, I mean, women have progressed in patenting. We've more than quintupled the representation among women patent holders over the years. Substantial progress in increasing women's representation among patent holders was made in the 80s and 90s, actually. But since then, progress has really slowed. That means by 2010, only about 19% of all patents granted had at least one inventor listed as one of the inventors on the patent. And then according to the recent analysis from the USPTO, this has increased to 21.9% by 2019. So an increase of less than 3 percentage points in almost 10 years. Additionally, according to the USPTO, the share of women among all US inventor patentees is only 12.8%. So really, we need to see faster progress. And while a lot of people talk about pipeline issues and women in STEM, we're seeing women graduate with STEM degrees, advanced STEM degrees, at a much faster rate than we are seeing progress on innovation and patenting and inventing. So there's a gap here that really needs to be closed. So while there has been progress in patenting, it's moving at a glacial pace. According to a recent analysis, it will take anywhere from 70 to 100 years to close the gender patenting gap. And before I move on, I should note that this is data for all women. The USPTO actually doesn't collect demographic data on patent applicants and grantees. All of the data that I presented here uses algorithms to do a best guess gender match based on name, which means it's not 100% accurate. The use of algorithms also means it's really hard to get intersectional data. People have done analysis on Black inventors, which actually showed that patenting activity by Black inventors peaked in 1899 and has not caught up since. So because we don't have the accurate demographic data, we don't have data on women of color specifically. However, given the data that we have on Black inventors and the challenges we know specifically that women of color face, the overlapping race, gender barriers that they face in both in the workplace and society, it's really safe to assume that women of color, especially Black women, apply for patents at even lower rates than white women. But we would love the data on this. So all of this, to me, is a clear sign that it will take proactive steps to close these gaps. And across the board, these steps need to happen. So IWPR saw this data and we said, why does this matter? It seems to many people, they say patenting, that seems so niche. When you really start to pull this issue apart, you see how important this is to economic well-being, to the well-being of the United States. I mean, it's interrelated to so many different issues, which I'll delve into here. Another thing that we know from Dr. Lisa Cook, who I know spoke previously, is that closing the patenting gaps would increase the annual GDP by $1 trillion. So IWPR also wanted to take a look at this, looking specifically at the impact that IP rights have on business outcomes, specifically for women entrepreneurs. So we did a little analysis. And the first thing that we looked at is what's going on with women-owned businesses. And we should keep in mind that women are making up an increasing share of all businesses. Women's business ownership is growing at a rate nearly 4 times as fast as men-owned businesses. So this graph shows you over time, women-owned businesses are exponentially growing. We need to make sure that this growth is sustainable and that women have the best chance at success. We need to eliminate barriers for women. And we'll see through this data that one way of addressing this is to tackle the gender gap in intellectual property holdings. So we did some analysis specifically looking at IP holdings among business owners. While intellectual property rights are not particularly common among business owners in general, there are gender gaps in intellectual property holdings. And as you can see from this graph here, especially for patents granted or even patents pending. That's the biggest gender gap among all of these different IP holdings. Men-owned businesses are more than twice as likely as women-owned businesses to hold a granted patent or a patent pending. It's a huge, huge gap. And IP tends to be more common in industries where there are few women-owned businesses. So just an example, 36.5% of all women-owned businesses in the information sector own at least one type of patent, which is great. But only 1% of all women-owned businesses operate in the information sector. So you're really narrowing down the shares of women-owned businesses that have IP based on the sectors that the women-owned businesses fall in. So if you look at it overall, the 4 industries with the highest share of IP holdings only include 6.7% of all women-owned businesses across the board. Yet IP holdings attract startup capital. Research has indicated that IP is an important decision-making factor for funders' decisions on whether or not to invest in a startup. This includes VCs, banks, and even friends and family. So having a patent or even a patent pending is huge. It helps bolster people's just interest and idea that this is going to be something that moves forward. And when we look at the startup phase and access to capital, we also found that women-owned businesses tend to have much less than men-owned businesses. As you can see here, women are more likely to have smaller amounts of money than men, and men-owned businesses were twice as likely to have $1 million or more in startup capital than women-owned businesses. The fact that women-owned businesses are less likely to hold IP may be partly contributing to this gender gap in startup funding, particularly in industries that are more IP intensive. So it's one of the many factors that goes into play when you're looking at business outcomes in startup. And at the same time, there's a substantial revenue advantage to holding intellectual property rights. As you can see here, women-owned businesses that held a patent pending earned an average of $17.5 million compared to with $1.1 million among businesses without any IP holdings. That's more than 16 times higher than women that don't have IP, women-owned businesses that don't have IP. And again, while intellectual property is not necessarily the sole cause of higher revenue, it is part of the story. It's one of the things that we can tackle as a means to evening the playing field for women. So all of IWPR's previous research kind of was looking at what's going on. What does the data show us? I'm going to go into a little bit more of our most recent research, which, like I said, came out last week. We wanted to show the whys of the patenting gap. So our most recent research dug really into this. The project aimed to discover the challenges and systemic barriers for women, particularly for women of color, during the patenting process. And we also wanted to identify the most crucial supports and gatekeepers that can help foster women along and ensure success. For the full findings, you can find all of our research on our website, IWPR.org, and I can drop that in the chat for people after I'm done. And this is the title, Tackling the Gender Gap and Gender and Racial Patenting Gap to Improve Innovation. So our methodology, real quick, in order to answer these questions, we conducted 21 semi-structured in-depth interviews with 16 women, 11 of whom were women of color, and 5 men. The interviews were conducted with participants that spanned a wide range of industries, geographical locations, ages, and stages of career. People who were just coming out of undergraduate schooling, all the way to people who were semi-retired and had been patenting for eons. This includes people who had 1 patent, all the way up to 80, 90 patents granted. So we really tried to give a wide range of experiences here. And the interviewees discussed experiences patenting in academia, within corporations, and as entrepreneurial endeavors. So some of the major findings from the report, and please check out the report because there's quotes and stories. And I'm just going to kind of breeze through some of the findings, but there's really a lot of richness in this data here. We found that women continually face systemic barriers to innovation patenting. Every single woman interviewed shared multiple stories of the ways that stereotypes, discrimination, and bias, whether conscious or unconscious, impacted them and their careers and the patenting process. This included a wide range of actors too: advisors, supervisors, peers, colleagues, investors, and from patent attorneys. We heard it all. Some even reported experiencing sexual harassment from these individuals and individuals they work with, including investors. There's some stories that came out where I wish I could say I was surprised, but I wasn't. But there's really some compelling stories. And we found that women of color in STEM fields face additional race gender biases, which can be really difficult to overcome because many, if not most, of these women are often the only in the room, the only woman or the only woman of color. Women who are the only are more likely to have negative experiences in the workplace, including having their abilities challenged or feeling like they are a stand-in for all women or all women of color. And just to give a brief overview, what does this look like in practice? Here are just a couple examples. We heard stories that are seemingly benign. They're not benign, but not being taken seriously. People questioning their qualifications by colleagues, peers, and patent attorneys, having to explain over and over again and say, no, I am the authority on this. Or even walking into a conference and people saying, oh, that's really great. Who invented that? I did. People telling them, oh, you're so brave that you're here as a woman, representing your company. And it's like, well, yes. Lots of stories like that. And then the one that was, the most, I would say, shocking and egregious was a woman who is a co-founder, has 2 male co-founders, was asked by an investor during a due diligence, so what's going on here? Are you guys in a 3-way relationship? And she said, that question would never have come up if I were a man. So just a few examples of what it can look like. Most of the women and all of the men interviewed attributed some of the lack of diversity in patenting to the lack of women and women of color in STEM. This lack of gender and racial diversity comes even as women continue to graduate with degrees. So really what we're looking at here is there are structural barriers, especially in the workplace. Women oftentimes face a motherhood penalty before they even have children. They might have children, so they're put on kind of a mommy track. They're pushed out of research. There's work-life balance issues. We know women shoulder the lion's share of caregiving at home and home chores, things like that, the unpaid labor that happens. These are all things that keep women from advancing in their careers at the same rate as men. Or it pushes women out of STEM and patent-intensive jobs altogether. We heard all of those types of stories. Another key finding was the lack of formal education on the patenting system. And this especially adversely impacts women and women of color throughout the patenting process. None of the inventors, including the men, received any formal education on patenting or innovation. But 5 women reported that they didn't even understand what constituted an invention when they first began. They didn't know that their idea could be patented. It didn't even cross their minds. A number of women also spoke about their lack of formal education, meaning they didn't know where to even start to find resources about patenting. 5 of the women said the lack of education also led to a confusion throughout the patenting process, including what it means to receive a rejection from the USPTO. When he said they didn't understand when a rejection was truly a rejection and when it was an opportunity to refine and resubmit their idea. So this lack of understanding, we heard stories of it following women throughout their careers. One woman said, I'm patented, we have like 4 patents, and I'm very involved in patenting, and still sometimes I'm extremely confused about the process and processes and what's next. It really highlights the importance of mentors and networks to support women throughout their innovation and patenting career. So informal education and mentorship is essential to women's success. And while many of the women we spoke to had support over the years, these women reported having to work harder to build networks and find mentors. It didn't just kind of come as easy as it seemed for the men who we interviewed, who were like, oh yeah, I connected with so-and-so and they like walked me through it and they became my mentor and it was great. 14 of the 16 women interviewed said they had to work harder to find resources, mentors, and networks to help them succeed. And as you can see from this quote, you know, this woman says, I feel like I had a lot of support, but I had to find it. I had to look for the opportunities. It wasn't like things just magically came to me. I had to go out of my way to learn and get the opportunities for myself. And that was a theme that echoed across the board. Women had to work hard to make things happen for them, much harder than the men we interviewed. So gatekeepers to the patenting process matter, and it can be the difference between success and failure to patenting. More than mentorship, having someone in the room to advocate on a young inventor's behalf helps new inventors get their names on patents. We heard this time and again from people who said, you know, so-and-so advocated for me in my workplace, or, you know, when I was in academia, and they put my name, they made sure I was not in the room when that patent application went through, and they made sure my name got on that patent application. And we also heard the reverse of people saying, I didn't know what patenting was. One woman, I didn't know what patenting was until I looked it up and I realized that my advisor had patented our invention without me. So really having someone in the room can make all the difference. Supervisors and within the corporate sphere and academic advisors who help ensure that women, and particularly women of color, get credit on patents early in their careers are crucial to making it to the success of patenting for new women who are trying to patent. Patent attorneys also can be a crucial support, helping inventors through the legalese of the patent application, through the process. We heard a lot of stories, though, again, of bias creeping in, really having a disconnect between the legal jargon and the technical language of an invention can create friction and challenges between inventors and patent attorneys. And a lot of the women said they oftentimes had to put in extra time and energy to really explain things and say, no, the way that you're writing this is no longer accurate. And technology transfer offices in the academic setting, again, they took the burden of time and money off of academics who want to invent, which is great. But again, oftentimes we heard bias creeps in towards established inventors who are already in the academic setting. It can make it difficult for new academics to utilize their resources. So what does this mean for racial and gender breakdowns? It means generally, you know, the established are older white men, and the new women of color who are coming through and trying to get attention don't get the attention they need or the attention they deserve. So we also looked, like I said, by sector, and women inventors in different settings, academia, corporate, entrepreneurship, also face unique barriers that can make it increasingly difficult for them to patent their inventions. As we said, in academia, the technology transfer offices are a major asset, but can also be a barrier. While they offer vital supports, there are actually limited opportunities for inventors to benefit financially, given that the IP is owned by the academic institution, much like a corporation. So if an academic wants to leave or wants to go out on their own and start their own entrepreneurial endeavor, they'll have to buy back their IP rights from the university, and women and women of color are much less likely to have the resources to do this. So really have to make a decision whether or not they want to patent under the academic institution or not. Finally, depending on one's field, patents are often not valued as highly as academic papers when it comes to promotions such as tenure. And this disincentivizes women from pursuing patents. They're seen as extras on the side, your own thing. And given the increased demands on women's time outside the workplace, this really doesn't leave a lot of opportunities for women to enter, for women in academia to enter into patent-intensive fields in patenting. So the main challenge for women inventors in entrepreneurship is funding, and by far. That was the one thing we heard time and time again. Given the high cost of quality patent attorneys, the limited access to pro bono services, the cost of defending IP rights, especially if it's a small startup, and just funding for the patent process is just a financial burden that many struggle to fill. They struggle to make those ends meet, especially if they're a new startup. At the same time, the lack of VC investments and seed money that goes to startups led by white women and women of color means they're also less likely to have the capital needed to patent and commercialize their ideas. The gender and racial wage and wealth gaps that we know exist in society means women have less access to their own capital to kind of plug these holes, or to family capital. It's so hard for women and women of color to find the resources they need to not only launch a startup, but then also pay for all the patenting costs on top of that. And patenting within a corporation, much like within university, means the inventor doesn't have to pay for patent attorneys or any of the filing costs. However, the one thing that we heard over time and again from women in the corporate sphere is understanding office politics is crucial for new women inventors. It's essential that women go beyond their immediate supervisors and develop relationships with other inventors, find mentors, and even develop relationships with the corporate patent attorneys. Often we heard that that's crucial. If you have an in with them, they're going to look at your stuff more often. As mentioned earlier, women have to work harder to build these networks. So it's an additional task on top of the work that they're doing just to fulfill their job duties. And it can keep women from successfully patenting within an organization. So overall, some of the lessons learned. While some women feel they have gained personally from patenting, it's either, they've gained because they've gotten promotions, it's been a boon financially to them, whatever the reasons. Others felt that the challenges often outweighed the benefits, or were pretty equal. They're like, yeah, it was great, but I thought it would put me on a different level. Women face just such a number of barriers to patenting that their male counterparts don't seem to experience. At the intersection of gender and race, women of color face a lot of additional barriers in patent-intensive fields. And these really need to be dug down on a little bit more and really examined. This research project, like I said, is just the first dive, and we would love to go more in depth and continue this work. This just means that tackling the gender and racial patenting gaps will take a concerted effort from a wide range of individuals, organizations, companies, and policymakers, really across the board. So one of the other research projects that I've done as part of this work is looking at programs. The good news is there are a number of programs across the United States dedicated to increasing diversity in patenting, innovation, and entrepreneurship. While there are quite a few programs in this space, there's actually little known about the various efforts being taken. In one specific ecosystem, you may know, but really what's going on across the United States, there's not a ton known. And there's not a ton known about what makes a program successful or more successful than others. This 2018 report describes some of the specific efforts to address the gender gaps in 7 programs across the country. So again, we just kind of took a slice of different programs working at different levels and really trying to see what are they doing, what is making them successful, and are there some common lessons learned and themes. So our report provides an in-depth profile of each program and offers insights and strategies. So I'm going to go through some of these pretty quickly just to give you a sense of kind of who we profiled, but also what are the lessons learned. So first we start with these 3 programs. The AWARE program really focused on building relationships to address the inequalities. The AWARE leaders took note of the other programs at the university and even in the surrounding area, and developed a model that made relationship building, networking, and mentoring the central focus, which really lines up with what a lot of women say, where they're lacking resources. Bio STLs Inclusion Initiative. They're a bioscience and entrepreneurship inclusion initiative in St. Louis, and they're really focused on building networks to change the entire ecosystem in St. Louis. They're a regional convener, investor, and catalyst. They help to develop bioscience technology industries in greater St. Louis. And their inclusion initiative focuses their diversity efforts at the regional level, really leveraging partners both to host events and connect individuals to the resources and partners they need to successfully commercialize their innovations and inventions. So really, they're kind of playing matchmaker, I would say. It really seems like that was their key function. Again, networks, building those networks, helping women and women, mainly women of color, connect to the resources they need. Empowering Women in Technology Startups, or EWICS, at the University of Florida, really focused on creating a dedicated space specifically for women, where women, they kind of balanced education about entrepreneurship and technology-based commercialization with having a safe environment when women can learn from other women mentors. They paired the women with mentors who could help guide them, answer questions, really focusing on what does this look like and how do you navigate this space. The last programs I'll focus on, My Startup XX is the University of California, San Diego, and they are really focusing on accelerating change through young women leaders. So they based their whole program on the belief that getting women to think about innovation and entrepreneurship at a young age will make the greatest impact on increasing gender and racial diversity. They specifically target students at UCSD. And while they are open to all students, every project must have a woman in a prominent leadership position. So then we have Reach for Commercialization at Ohio State. They focus really on faculty and staff. They're really pairing education and network building to bring research to practice. They have a structured program balancing education, and then again, emphasis on building networks and relationships with mentors. Then we looked at the U.S. Department of Energy's Phase Zero Assistance Program, and it provides one-on-one support to help women and minority-owned participants really build competitive SBIR and STTR grant applications. They work individually with participants on their applications, and they connect them to business mentors and industry experts who provide one-on-one advice and assistance throughout the process. Again, networks and that informal education component across the board for all of these is such a huge thing. And finally, STEM to Market offers online resources to women of color in STEM while also addressing investor bias. So they have a two-pronged approach. They have an accelerator side that focuses on providing virtual program model with holistic approach, really meeting women where they are and giving them the supports that they need. And on the investing side, engaging with investors and funders within the STEM-based startup world, providing them tools to mitigate bias in their funding processes. So those were quickly the people that the programs that we profiled. And while each of the programs has taken a different approach, there are some common strategies. Information sharing and education is crucial across the board. This really addresses the lack of formal education on patenting and commercialization processes. There's a huge component. A lot of these programs have very structured educational components to their programs, structured curriculum, one-on-one advice, or seminar-based instruction. The next one is network building and mentorship. Again, this is just such a huge need that needs to be met to help women get the resources they need. The lack of networks and sponsors needed to take an innovation from idea to market is just it's such a huge barrier for women. And so most of these programs focused on helping women build these networks. And then a lot of these programs, surprisingly, were focused on culture change. They all were striving to foster broader culture change in their ecosystem about patenting, innovation, and entrepreneurship and the diversity gaps. They did awareness raising campaigns. They spoke out about the importance of diversity to a broader audience, including students, faculty, staff at university, stakeholders in local communities, and investors. So really working on that culture change piece was a big component for a lot of these programs. And then tracking outcomes. Each program either formally or informally tracked outcomes. They had concrete goals and metrics, and they really tried to keep themselves accountable. And if they weren't meeting those goals, they changed, and they changed upon the, based on the needs that they saw. So where does all of this research leave us? Where do we go from here so that we're not left waiting 100 years for parity in patenting? The good news is there are multiple entry points for policymakers, corporations, academic institutions, programs, and individuals. So I'm going to go through these, trying quickly because I know I'm coming up against time here soon. First, programs. Identify and understand your target audience. Who are you trying to serve? Is it students, early career women, faculty? Make a decision and target that audience. Define your scope of work in order to address the key gaps for your target audience. This may take research, but effective programs are usually targeted at and really trying to hit some concrete metrics and have measurable goals. Also, don't reinvent the wheel. Take a look at what's being offered already and try not to duplicate those efforts in the area. And then build relationships with key stakeholders and partners in the local community. When it comes to academic institutions, organizations, and corporations, here's just a quick little snapshot of what they can do. Invest resources in research in this area. I know we are personally funded by Qualcomm, who's very invested in making sure this research gets out there. So invest in research to push these issues forward. Do internal research. What are the gaps within your own organization? What are the specific challenges that women and women of color face when trying to innovate and patent and commercialize? And then work to address those specific issues. So, tackle systemic racial and gender bias and discrimination, unconscious, conscious bias, do it all. Implement programs and be proactive. And then invest and promote internal policies that promote work-life balance and keep women in the workplace. Access to paid leave, sick leave, flexible work schedules, and employer-sponsored childcare are just a few that I can think of off the top of my head. And then invest in access to quality patent attorneys and talk to them about bias, conscious or unconscious. That's one way that it creeps in that maybe companies and organizations and academic institutions are not aware of. And then invest in accelerated programs for women and women of color. Some academic institutions have already invested. Corporations could sponsor programs in their area, or just invest in them generally. Policymakers, so this could be federal, state, whatever level. There's a lot that can be done. As a researcher, I always think more research is needed. Specifically want to call out that we need that accurate demographic information from the USPTO. It's really vital that we have this. Again, bias, tackle bias within your systems. Establish programs that promote early exposure to STEM for all women, particularly women of color. Work on developing formula curricula on the patenting process that can be utilized for academic institutions, even starting as early as high school. This could cut so much of that information gap down. Invest in childcare policies that promote work-life balance and keep women in the workplace. Other policies such, like I said, paid family and medical leave for all, universal access to quality, affordable childcare, universal health care. All of these things would really help kind of cut and mitigate some of the issues that women face. Provide additional funding for government-run programs. Pro bono access to patent attorneys is one of them. Expand all of that. And one of them is make your grant funding more flexible. We heard from a lot of people that SBIR and STTR grant funds for entrepreneurs only allow inventors to spend money on patenting in the phase 2 grants. Really look at what those policies are and see, is this hurting the people you're trying to help the most? And then none of this would be possible without individuals, obviously. If you're sitting there wondering, how do I start? How do I get involved? How do I make change? Just get involved. Find local initiatives and programs working on these issues and see how you can get involved. Maybe as a mentor, maybe as a pro bono attorney. Maybe it's to connect these programs and initiatives to the resources they need. Find a gap and jump in. Be the voice in the room, especially in the workplace. You've been attending this conference, so you know now, hopefully, you hopefully have the information, additional information you need. Find out if your institution or place of work is even addressing any of this, even looking at this. Have a conversation, bring it up, bring your knowledge and be the advocate in your space. And join policy and advocacy efforts. Join with organizations like Invent Together to actively work on policy change. Advocacy does bring change. So that is my presentation. Thank you so much. I will stick around and see if I can take some questions.
Hey, Elise, that was awesome. This is Suzanne. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. And so, you know, the people on the line are mostly corporates. And so there's a lot of questions about what are key programs that industry can do to really focus and help women inventors here. So there's a lot of different ways that that's been asked. So any kind of thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, so again, bias as a researcher is always do your research. I think that while there are some general universalities, you know, there's some general systemic barriers that women and women of color will face across the workplace that need to be addressed. You know, do your research on what's going on within your own industry, within your own corporation. I know when we were really starting early on with a lot of this work, we were actually looking for corporations who were actively working on this issue, specifically innovation and patenting, and we couldn't find any. So if you're at a loss for where to start, you're not alone. The really cool thing is we had a really great conversation with Procter & Gamble, and they said, we're not looking at this. This is really interesting. Maybe this is why on the R&D track, we're lagging on our metrics. We're seeing women progress up our corporate leadership rungs in other areas at much faster rates. But we haven't even looked at, is patenting and having a patent part of our promotion process in these areas? What does that look like? Is it universal across the board? Where are women dropping off in this area and how is it impacting them? And they started with research. And I know that they now are really trying to work internally on this and really trying to focus on that. But it really starts with conversations and understanding what the barriers are. I wish I could say like there's a universal like fix it all button that everyone could apply across the board. But we know from research, especially when it comes to like DEI efforts, that's not true. There's no kind of cookie cutter approach, unfortunately. It takes work, it takes dedication, and it takes a lift often. But really doing that, what's going on in our ecosystem? In our interviews, one of the men we interviewed said, you know, even starting with something having pathways so people can report up on what's going on. They said they got anonymous comment one time in the corporation he worked in saying, you know, from a Black woman saying, hey, unless I put my supervisor on as someone who helped with the patent, they don't push it forward. And they were shocked. They had no idea this was going on. And so they did an investigation and they found it was true. And then they had to address the issue. So, you know, you can't address it until you know what the problem is.
So again, just trying to summarize a little bit here. A lot of it is to examine your own processes and get feedback from your underrepresented inventor group and see where you can make some changes. And then, you know, again, if you want to compare yourselves to industry, others in your industry or national, you can do that as well. How would you say companies can get involved with any ongoing research that you're doing? What's the best way for them to do that?
I mean, they can reach out to me directly. My email's here. I direct this whole program area, so I'm kind of the point of contact for all of this. And if we're not specifically doing the research, there's ways to get involved with taking the research that's already there, and using that in your own internal efforts or external efforts if you're really trying to go out there and kind of push for change as a corporation to really lift up this research. And then we can have conversations. Like I said, this body of research that we've been doing has been funded by Qualcomm. There's always room for more people to invest in research. Again, whether that's with us or other research institutions, those are great ways for corporations to really support the research that's going on out there.
Okay, and then one of the things you mentioned early on was, what we're calling advocating for change, but getting involved and advocating for a variety of different things. And so some of the questions are around, well, can you give us what are some good things to advocate for? What kind of change? What are, systemic or policies that, that companies should be thinking about?
If you're speaking specifically for like advocacy efforts in the policy world, are you thinking of? So if companies want to get involved with things, I mean, so really supporting initiatives. I know, Invent Together is kind of our advocacy arm. So we do the research because we're nonpartisan and nonprofit. We really try and present the research and let it lead. But I know Invent Together is really working hard on the IDEA Act, which has passed the Senate, and it's actually a call on the USPTO to collect demographic data on patent holders. So, I mean, I would say reach out to the people who are working directly on these issues and being, already doing the advocacy. They have great resources out there that you can look at for ways to get involved in advocacy efforts, things to do, ways to support all the different things that are going on. It's really great that we do have these organizations out there working on this issue, because again, I'm a proponent of don't reinvent the wheel. Look at who's out there in the ecosystem and join in. And then, reach out to legislators and policymakers and say, we gotta improve gender and racial equity issues in the workplace. Those broad issues, tackling wage gap issues, tackling hiring and promotion issues. Those are all really important.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of things companies can do without having to go the legislation route. I mean, certainly for large things like gathering data on a wholesale effort with the IDEA Act, that's great. But I think also just talking about this and talking about some of these issues, normalizing this discussion is another way, I think, to advocate for change. So not being afraid to have the conversation or talking about maybe some things that aren't working or some things that are. I would encourage people to do that.
Yeah, and I think within your own corporation or company, really level the playing field. One of the things that we know that really helps women in the workplace is, equitable policies that people actually use when it comes to taking time off for family leave reasons, whether that's to care for themselves, a loved one, or a new child. If we normalize men as caregivers and that becomes the norm, we're going to start to close some of that stigma and bias on the mommy track. The whole talking to women and saying, oh, are you sure you're going to take on that career or go into that? It's really not going to pair well with having a family, things that are never said to men. So, I think one of the things, there's a lot of corporations out there that are really trying to push the envelope on this, and kind of saying, we're going to equalize our paid leave, maternity and paternity, so that you get time off to be with your kid and to bond. And we know that's just as important for fathers out there as mothers, but some of that stuff can normalize the things within the workplace so that, again, it's not a woman's issue. This is how do we promote work-life balance for all of our workers and ensure that women are not kind of bearing the brunt of all of these issues.
And so, Elyse, if you think back through a lot of the interviews you guys did for this study, was there a particular early intervention that could have really changed the trajectory for a lot of these women? Was there anything that came up, or a few key points along the process that would have been really meaningful for them if somebody had stepped in at that point? Can you point those out for us or help us understand a little bit more about that?
Yeah, specifically for corporations, I'll say, some of the women talked about, again, just this lack of understanding of the process within the company. What does it look like? Do you have to go through your supervisor? What is that, making sure that everybody knows from the moment they step in the door, what the process is, what that looks like. It just takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. And I think it should be available for anyone within the corporation to access, not just people who are in jobs that their name might get on a patent, because you never know where your ideas are going to come from. I think that it's really important. We heard some stories from women of this mentor took me under their wing and showed me the ropes. I became friends with the patent attorney, and I had no idea that I needed to build those relationships too. I just thought if I did my job and I did a good job, I would be rewarded accordingly. And that's not always the case. And in fact, more often than not, that's not the case. Women have to go out of their way. And so, again, I think that actually is a systems level issue that needs to be addressed by leadership. Equalize that playing field for all of your employees and ensure that it's not kind of a black box process. Make sure that it's open and transparent, and bring new inventors into the room when it's being discussed whose name gets on a patent. Things like that. It's not a small group discussion that if you don't have someone in the room speaking up for this person who's not even there, then they get left off. So I think that there are systemic changes that need to happen within organizations, at least from what we heard from a lot of women.
Well, I think for all the patent attorneys listening to this, if you ever wondered if you have an impact on people, I think you now know that you can make the most meaningful impact in the way you least expect it.
Honestly, yes. Patent attorneys were, I always thought patent attorneys were going to be key, crucial gatekeepers, but I didn't realize that we had so many stories of patent attorneys acting as mentors. And it was, and supporters. We had one woman who said she worked with this female patent attorney who, really just was flexible with her and wanted to support her as a female entrepreneur, and really went above and beyond to ensure that she got what she needed and was connected to the resources she needed.
That's awesome. Well, I want to say thank you so much for sharing all this research with us. I encourage all of you who are on the line to reach out to Elyse and figure out how you can work with her organization and her personally. And I really appreciate all this effort. And, hopefully everyone will go into a networking session, and we'll see you online at the next session in a 10 or 15 minutes. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.